Well, welcome to week 5 of our class, Covenant and God's Purpose for the World. I hope that you've taken the time to watch the other 4 weeks as we've walked through the different covenants, the main covenants in the Bible, and then how those covenants help us to see and understand God's purpose for the world. You remember that we said at the beginning in week 1, as we talked about our introduction to this class, that it is really difficult to understand the meta narrative, the overall redemptive history of Israel and the redemptive history of what God is doing from Genesis to Revelation without understanding the major covenants in the Bible. And so, what we're doing is looking at 6 major covenants as we move through on our way to the new covenant, which we'll look at in week 6. So, this week in week 5, we're going to look at the covenant with David. As we look at the way that God in 2 Samuel 7, so it's where we're going to be primarily today, is 2 Samuel 7. We'll turn to some other places as well. But you can go ahead and turn there as we're just getting ready. But we're going to look together at 2 Samuel 7 at the covenant that God makes with David, maybe the greatest king that Israel ever had. And then the only covenant we have left is the new covenant, which we'll look at next week in week 6. And just sort of recap as we move back through these, we started with the creation covenant, with God's creation covenant with Adam and Eve. And he makes them in his image. They're what we call vice regents. They represent God. They are to be his representatives, to take his glory and his rule, his reign, from the borders of Eden all the way to all of the earth, right, over the whole face of the earth. They were to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. They were called to represent God as his vice regents, made in his image across the whole planet. And what happens? They fail, right? They don't keep the covenant that God laid out, blessings and curses, stipulations of the covenant. They fail, and sin enters into the world, and we saw how that gets worse. It leads us then to the covenant with Noah, where God judges the entire human race and only spares Noah and his family. And then God makes a covenant after that with Noah, agreeing to and promising to never destroy the earth, but to keep the earth, to sustain it until the end of all things. Then we move from the covenant with Noah down the line. Again, we think, well, things might get better, but instead they get worse. And so we move on down the line to the covenant with Abraham. And we look at the way that God calls Abraham up out of the Ur of Chaldeas, that he makes a great nation out of him. You remember those three-fold promise, the promise of offspring, the promise of land, and the promise of blessing, that God is going to use Abraham to bless all of the nations. And remember, we talked about, as we've looked at the last 4 weeks, the way that throughout the Old Testament we have maybe what we might call a narrowing or a clarification of the promise of God, is that we see that God is going to redeem his people, right? That's promised all the way back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, where we're told that there's going to be a seed of the woman who's going to crush the head of the serpent, that this seed is going to come, and we know that God's going to do that. He's going to keep his promise, and these different covenants sort of move the ball down the field. They help us to understand, well, how is that going to happen? Well, first we know it's going to come from the seed of the woman, and then we know from the covenant with Noah, right, that it's going to happen, that God won't destroy the world again until this has happened. Then we know with the covenant through Abraham that it's not just going to happen through anybody, but it's going to happen through Abraham, right? And not just through Abraham alone, but ultimately through Isaac, that Isaac is going to be the child of promise, that this king who's going to come from Abraham is going to bring land and offspring and blessing to all the nations of the earth, and he's going to come through the line of Abraham. And then you move to the covenant with Israel that we looked at last week, where God is calling Israel out, adopting Israel as his son, that the whole nation belongs to him. He's set them apart. He's made them his own, that the covenant is going to come through Abraham, through the line of Abraham, through Isaac, ultimately through Israel. And we looked at last week the covenant with Israel and the curses and the blessings, the stipulations that are laid out. And we talked about the way that it is both conditional and unconditional, or rather, for the covenant of Israel, that it's not unconditional, it is conditional. The way that God lays out this conditionality and conditional and obsolete is what I meant to say, that it has built-in conditionality and obsolescence, right? That it is conditional, that people are called to obey, to keep the law, and then it was made to be obsolete one day, right? It was made to go away when it's fulfilled in the new covenant. And this leads us then into this week's covenant, as we look at the covenant with David, which is the next progression in the covenants. Again, all these covenants are distinct, that they're different. They're not exactly the same thing, but they are not disconnected, right? It's not as if these are 5 different dispensations that we've looked at, that these all in some ways are connected, that we might think about them as individual covenants with sort of a grand covenant of grace overarching all of it. And so let's turn our attention now to 2 Samuel 7. What I want to do is read 2 Samuel 7 and just get the sort of bear witness of the text to the inauguration of the covenant, to what God says here. Though there are other texts that reference this, 1 Chronicles 17. We're going to look at some Psalms later who reference this covenant. So this isn't the only place we find this, but this is the primary text for the inauguration of the covenant. So I want to look at it, and then we're going to work our way, just like we've done with the other covenants, work our way through some of the major features, some of the major characteristics of the covenant. So let's look at 2 Samuel verse 7, or chapter 7, verse 1. It says, "Now when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all the surrounding enemies, the king said to Nathan the prophet, 'See, now I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent.'" The ark is the very representation of the presence of God. Nathan said to the king, "Go, do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you." But that same night the word of the Lord came to Nathan. "Go and tell my servant David, 'Thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent for my dwelling.'" That will be the tabernacle. "In all places where I have moved with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, 'Why have you not built me a house of cedar?' Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, 'Thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following sheep, that you should be a prince over my people. And I have been with you wherever you went, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make for you a great name." Where have we heard that before? Abram. "I will make for you a great name like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them." Where have we heard that before, right? Promise of land. Now, we've heard the same thing with Abraham. "I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place, and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly. For the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish your kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And when he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." In accordance with all these words, in accordance with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David. So David wants to build God a temple. David says, "I'm living in a cedar house. God's in the tabernacle. He's in a tent. And I need to build God a temple." Nathan initially says, "Do what you have purposed in your heart to do. God's with you." And then God comes to Nathan and says, "No, that's not what I want you to do at all." And then gives this covenant to David, gives Nathan this message to deliver to David. So let's talk about the inauguration of the covenant for just a moment. One, we got to sort of back up in the storyline a little bit. And remember, how does David come to be king? Well, who was the first king of Israel? If you remember, we come out of the period of the judges. The Israelites want to be like the nations around them. They want a king like the other nations. Now, ultimately, when we read the Torah, when we read the first 5 books of the Old Testament, who is supposed to be the king of Israel? Who's supposed to be their king? Well, God is supposed to be their king. God is supposed to reign over them. And they essentially come to God and say, "Well, we don't want you to be our king. We want a king like the rest of the world. We want a king like the nations around us." And God chooses to give them a king, but he tells them from the very get that it's not going to be good for them. And God gives them Saul. Right? Saul's tall, handsome, strong, looks like the other kings around them. And God ultimately rejects Saul as king for 2 main reasons. If you remember in 1 Samuel 15, that God sends the Israelites to wipe out the Amalekites, right? They had tried to wipe out the Israelites years before, generations before, and as they were coming up into the out of the Exodus towards the Promised Land, coming through the wilderness. And so God now is bringing judgment on the Amalekites, and Saul was told to commit them all to destruction, right? That none shall live. And what we find is that Saul doesn't do that. He disobeys. He saves the best cattle for himself. He spares the king of the Amalekites. He disobeys God. He chooses not to do what God had asked him to do. And then the second big piece there is, if you'll remember, Saul visits what the text calls a necromancer in 1 Samuel 28, a witch, right? I grew up hearing about Paul and the witch at Endor, where he essentially goes and asks her to summon the spirit of Samuel. We don't have time to sort of go into that story. It's a really strange story that is really fascinating to read it and to study, but ultimately what we're told is that Saul blatantly violates what God had told him to do. That nobody in Israel should be going to a witch. No one should be going to a necromancer. No one should be seeking to deal with magic. And Saul does. So he disobeys God and the battle of the Amalekites. He disobeys God by going to see a necromancer or a witch, the witch at Endor. That what we see is, these are two prominent examples, but not the only ones, is that Saul essentially is a king who refuses to obey God. And the king of Israel must be a king who obeys God, right? If the king is going to represent Israel, which is we're told the king does, that the blessings and the curses are going to come to Israel based on the obedience of the king. If the king is obedient and lives according to the law, blessing will come upon him and the people. And if the king is a bad king and disobeys the law and does not worship the Lord, then curses are going to come upon the people. And what we find is that Saul's a bad king. He refuses to obey God. And we see this time and time again in all sorts of different ways. And so David is brought in. And if you read the storyline in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, which, by the way, it's just one book, right? We got split up a long time ago just for length's sake, but it's one book. So you can talk about the book of Samuel, though we know 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. They really go together. It's one storyline. When you read the storyline of David in the book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd, what we find is that the trust of David is highlighted, that David believes God, David trusts God, David's willing to obey God, to rest in the sovereignty and the protection and the strength of the Lord in a way that Saul is not. That is highlighted in the life of David. 1 Samuel, if you think about even very early on in David's life, the story that we all love of David and Goliath, that's a story about David's trust in God to deliver his people, right? David doesn't trust in his own strength. David doesn't trust in his own ability to defeat Goliath. He trusts the Lord. He trusts the promises of God. This is highlighted throughout the book. So what we find in David then is one who trusts God. This is highlighted, if you go back to 2 Samuel 2, this is highlighted in Hannah's song. When Hannah sings that the song is there in 2 Samuel 2, there's this theme of exalting those who are humble before the Lord and trust Him, and a humbling, right? A tearing down of those who are haughty and prideful and think that they can survive without the Lord. And so that's the narrative that plays out in the book of Samuel, right? That Saul is torn down. Saul is laid low before the Lord and because he was prideful. And David is exalted. He's humble. He trusts God. And so the story of the book of Samuel is David being exalted to be what is arguably the greatest king that Israel has ever seen. Certainly not a perfect king, but maybe the greatest king outside of Christ, which we'll get to, that Israel has ever seen. That David again and again and again is demonstrating his trust for the Lord throughout the book. So this is the context then in which 2 Samuel 7 comes to us, that David wanted to build a house for the Lord, but he wasn't able to. God says, I don't want you to build a house for me. I never asked you to build a house for me. Instead, I'm going to build a house for you. There's a bit of a play on words here, that David is talking about a literal house of worship, a literal temple. And what God does is use that word house to mean not a literal building, but to build a house, to build offspring, to build a dynasty, we might use the word that sort of fits for our context a little better. That God is going to build a dynasty out of David, that God's going to raise up his offspring up after him, that one of his offspring, we know that to be Solomon, is going to get to build the temple in a way that God's not going to allow David to do. But then we're told that God is going to keep the throne, right? That a descendant of David will sit on the throne for all time, right? That the scepter will not depart from his feet, that this is going to be established, and he's going to establish his kingdom forever. Now, again, we don't see the word covenant in 2 Samuel 7. At this point, you should know that should not trouble us, right? We have plenty of reason to believe that this actually is a covenant based on other textual evidence, based on what we see here and the way that this is referred to in other places. It certainly is a covenant, even though the word isn't used here. And that the promise that is made to Abraham is that if you remember, is that God is going to bless the nations through Abraham. That all people are going to be blessed through this king that's going to come through the line of Abraham. Well, the Davidic covenant does. The covenant with David is in some ways give us the means by which that's going to happen, right? That it's the promises made to Abraham, this blessing that's going to come to the nation, that's going to happen now, we know, not just through any of Abraham's offspring, but now we know that this is going to happen not just to the nation of Israel, right? But it's going to happen through David. right? That the king that's going to come, that's going to bring blessing, not just to his people, but to all the nations, that all those who will come and live under the reign of God will find blessing. That king is going to come from the line of David, right? Again, this is a narrowing of the promise, right? A clarification of the promise. How is God going to keep his promise to save his people and to bring blessing and not cursing to the earth? Well, it's going to come this way, so that the means of ultimate promise of land, the means of ultimate promise of offspring, the means of ultimate promise of blessing to the nations, that's going to come now, as we see through this 2 Samuel 7 covenant with David. That's going to come through David. That's going to come through the Davidic line, the royal line of David. God is making and establishing that covenant forever. Again, as we talk about the king in the Pentateuch, this theme, that this promise that God has made is going to be kept through a king, is not new, right? We go all the way back. Abraham, we looked at last week and 2 weeks ago. Abraham was told that a king was going to come from his line. So that this has been hinted at for a long time. So that when we come to the covenant with David, it shouldn't surprise us that God is using a royal line, that God is using a king to bring about these promises. It's just now we know that king is David, and that royal line is the Davidic line, because this has been hinted at all throughout the scriptures. It's not new at all. Abraham is told this in Genesis 17. It's confirmed again to Jacob in Genesis 35. In Genesis 49, we're told that a ruler is going to come from Judah, that the scepter will not depart from his feet. In Numbers 24, 17 through 19, we're told again that a ruler is going to come from Judah, that he's going to defeat his enemies, that he's going to bring these promises that have been made to Abraham. Right? These things have been talked about for a long time, long before David came on the scene. The idea that God was going to use a royal line, use a kingly Davidic line, or a kingly royal line, to save his people, to bring about the promises, is not new. We just didn't know it was going to be Davidic. We didn't know that it was going to be David. And honestly, this is part of the way that God is working. If you were just to sort of see David and Saul next to each other, we would think Saul would be the one. Right? In the same way that Abraham tries to sort of push Ishmael forward and say, no, this is the son of promise. And God says, no, it's not Ishmael. It's the son you don't have yet. Right? I'm going to bless you with Isaac when you're an old man and nobody thinks that you can have babies. No one thinks that you can have a son anymore. That's the son I'm going to bring the promise through. That we look at Saul, and he's the one that the world loves. He's tall, he's strong, he looks like a king. We would say, that's the king, that's the line. And God says, no, that's not the line. Right? That's not the king. It's David. It's the small, ruddy guy. This is the one I'm going to raise up. This is the kingly line through which the promised Messiah is going to come. This is the kingly line through which the people of God are going to be in the land of God, which the people of God are going to be fruitful and multiplying, which the people of God are going to find blessing for all the nations, that all the nations of the earth are going to come and join the nation of God and live under the rule of Yahweh. This is going to happen not through Saul, but it's going to happen instead through David. Now, with many of the covenants we've talked about, there is both an unconditional and a conditional part of the covenant. Both things are true, right? So that we do see there are clear conditions, right? It says in verse 14 of chapter 7, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the Son of Men. That we're told that disobedience within this covenant is going to bring discipline, right? There are clear, not just here, but other places, there are clear examples. We see this in the life of David, if you keep reading on. We see David is disciplined. We see Solomon is disciplined. We see the kings that come after David, the kings that are even in his line. We see them disciplined by God. So there is a conditional part of the covenant, and that they are called to keep the covenant. They are called to obey God, to be conduits of blessing for the people of God, that they are, as the king of Israel, representatives of the people of God. They're to keep the covenant. They're to keep the law. They're to obey and worship the Lord, to live under his rule, that blessing may come to them and ultimately then through them to their people. And if they don't, curses are going to come. They're going to be cursed, and they're going to bring curses and judgment on their people. God, even within this covenant, says, if he sins, when he commits iniquity, I'll discipline him with rods, with the stripes of the sons of men, right? But at the same time, he says in verse 15, right after that, but my steadfast love will not depart from him. So that we see both things. That it is conditional, that there is obedience demanded from the king, and that blessing will come with obedience and curses will come with disobedience. But he says at the same time, I will not remove my love for him. There is an unconditional piece of the covenant here, that ultimately God will keep his promise. Ultimately, God will keep the promise. God will bring all that he has promised. God will keep the covenant and will not finally, ultimately, remove his hand from his anointed. He will not remove his hand from the line of David. Even throughout discipline, even when they sin against him, God will not remove his hand from them, but God will make sure that the promise will come, that the promise will be fulfilled, even though through individual kings, even though an individual king in the line may be disciplined for sin, God is ultimately not going to abandon the covenant. God is ultimately not going to abandon the promise. So again, we see both things. We want to say again that there's a temptation to put these covenants in an unconditional bucket or in a conditional bucket. And what we want to see is that the covenants don't fit really, most of them don't fit really squarely in either. That they have conditional elements and unconditional elements. We see the same thing here with the covenant with David. There is a conditional element that obedience is demanded, and kings will be disciplined. Kings will be removed from power. They'll be removed from leadership because of their wickedness and their refusal to trust God. At the same time, there's an unconditional element, and that God is going to see this through, that God is going to ultimately not remove his hand, not remove his love from them, that God is going to ultimately make sure that the covenant is kept and the promise comes. I want to read to you, sort of reference real quickly, a few places in which Schreiner talks about this. If you have the book, this is on page 77. Schreiner says, if we had any doubt about whether the promise to David was a covenant, it's removed in Psalm 89 and 132. We are told specifically that God made a covenant with David in verse 3, in verse 28, in verse 34, and verse 39, and then in 132, verse 12. What bothers the psalmist in Psalm 89 is that the promises made to David seem to be withdrawn. That's verses 39 through 51. And such a state of affairs doesn't fit with the permanence of David's covenant, right? That it seems that they've been withdrawn because of conditional disobedience, but it doesn't seem to fit with the unconditional piece, that God's not going to remove his steadfast love forever. Verses 28 to 29 say, quote, my steadfast love I will keep for him forever, and my covenant will stand firm for him. I will establish his offspring forever, and his throne is the days of heaven. The psalmist recognizes that the covenant has clear conditions. Quote, if his children forsake my law and do not walk according to my rules, if they violate my statutes and do not keep my commandments, then I will punish their transgression with a rod and their iniquity with stripes. No king who departs from the Torah will experience Torah blessings. In that sense, the covenant is conditional. We see the same condition in Psalm 132. Quote, if your sons keep my covenant and my testimonies that I shall teach them, their sons also forever shall sit on your throne. That's verse 12. Ultimately, however, the covenant is unconditional. After noting the conditions of the covenant, we read these crucial words in Psalm 89. I will not remove from him my steadfast love or be false to my faithfulness. I will not violate my covenant or alter the word that went forth from my lips. Once for all I have sworn by my holiness. I will not lie to David. His offspring shall endure forever, his throne as long as the sun before me. Like the moon it shall be established forever, a faithful witness in the skies. That's verses 33 through 37. That God promised that David would have a son sitting on the throne. God's promise, rather, that David would have a son sitting on the throne will not be revoked. Although any king who turns away from God, he in himself individually will be disciplined. Right, so that there is this tension that we've seen in the other some of the other covenants between the conditional element of obedience and the unconditional element. The same is true here. Individual kings may be disciplined and may be removed from the throne, but God says, I am not going to revoke my covenant. I'm going to be faithful to keep the promise that ultimately a son of David will sit on the throne for all time, that he will sit on the throne for all eternity. The scepter will never depart from beneath him, that his reign will be eternal. His reign will be forever. So it then creates in the Old Testament from David going forward a longing then to figure out who is that son of David, right? Who is this one that's going to come in the royal line that is going to sit on the throne forever? And you might think, well, this might be David. And you read through the line, and you go, well, it's not David, right? It's that David is not perfect. David, though, is often a good king and a righteous king, that David is not the righteous king. He's not the king who's going to rule forever. You think, well, maybe it's Solomon, the wisest man who's ever lived. You read the life of Solomon. It's not Solomon. And after that, the kingdom splits, and we have a mixture of sort of good kings and bad kings, and some good kings, very few good kings, and then some really bad kings. And you have this sort of rolling narrative throughout the Old Testament that creates for us this longing of, when's this king going to come? When is this son of David going to come sit on the throne? When is this son of David going to come and rule the nations and rule forever? This tension between the conditional and the unconditional is creating this longing for us in the Old Testament of who can meet the conditional needs of the covenant, who can come and be a righteous, obedient king, and ultimately then reap the unconditional benefits that God has promised to do. Who's going to be able to fulfill this? Again, hint, hint, it's Jesus, right? We've seen this in all of the covenants, that this is pointing us ultimately to Christ as the king. So talk about the conditional, unconditional elements. Let's talk about, keep your bookmark there in 1 Samuel 7, and go with me to Psalm 72. Psalm 72 is an important psalm. It's vital, has a vital role in helping us to understand the relationship between the covenant of Abraham with the covenant of David, right? That this covenant with David is clearly messianic, and it's pointing us forward to Christ. Psalm 72 is clearly a messianic psalm that is asking God to essentially to give the king the rule and reign that he's promised, to give God's royal son justice and strength to bless God's people, right? That there is, at the same time in this, well, let's just read it, and then we'll piece back through it. Psalm 72 says, "Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. Let the mountains bear prosperity for the people, and the hills in righteousness. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people and give deliverance to the children of the needy and crush the oppressor. May they fear you while the sun endures and as long as the moon throughout all generations. May he be like rain that falls on the mown grass, like the showers that water the earth. In his days may the righteous flourish and peace abound till the moon be no more." This is a really important piece. Listen to verse 8. "May he have dominion from sea to sea," not from Egypt to the river Euphrates, but from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. "May desert tribes bow down before him, and enemies lick the dust. May the kings of Tarshish and of the coastlands render him tribute. May the kings of Sheba and Seba bring gifts. May all the kings fall down before him. All nations serve him. Right? For he delivers the needy when he calls, the poor man and him who has no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy, and saves the lives of the needy. From oppression and violence he redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight. Long may he live. May gold of Sheba be given to him. May prayers be made for him continually, and blessings invoked for him all day. May there be abundance of grain in the land. On the tops of the mountains may it wave. May its fruit be like Lebanon, and may people blossom in the cities like the grass of the field. May his name endure forever. His fame continues as long as the sun. May people be blessed in him. All nations call him blessed. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who alone does wondrous things. Blessed be his glorious name forever. May the whole earth be filled with his glory. Amen and amen." The prayers of David, the son of Jesse, are ended. What Psalm 72 does is point us then in verses 8 through 11, points us to this universal blessing that's going to come, right? So Schreiner puts it this way, helpfully. Verses 8 through 11 are remarkable, and the reference is to the Davidic king, that clearly the promise made to Abraham of universal blessings will be fulfilled in the king. The enemy licking the dust also alludes to the victory over the serpent. You may have thought that was a weird phrase. He says, may the, in verse, I just missed it there. Back half of verse 9. May he desert tribes bow down before him and enemies lick the dust. That is a reference then, an allusion to his victory over the serpent who slithers in the dust, which supports the notion that the covenant with Abraham fulfills the promises enunciated in Genesis 3:15. That the allusion to the universal blessing promised to Abraham is unmistakable in Psalm 72, right? Quote, "May people be blessed in him, all nations call him blessed." Right? That's clearly Abrahamic covenant language. And we find now that clearly this promise, the promise of worldwide blessing given to Abraham, will be fulfilled through a son of David. The Davidic covenant is organically related to the covenant with Abraham, and the son of David will be the means by which the promises made to Abraham will come to pass. So the connection, as we've already said to some degree, between the covenant with Abraham and the covenant with David is that the means by which the covenant with Abraham, of offspring, of land, of blessing to the nations, is going to come now through this covenant with David, with David's house, that the ruler, the king, the royal one, the royal Messiah who's going to bring the blessing is going to come from the line of David. We don't have time to look at this, but again, we see all of these things in other places in the Psalms. Psalm 72 is a really important one for us to see. A couple more pieces we want to look at: the Davidic promise in Israel's history and the prophets. Again and again and again, as we move through the Old Testament storyline, we see that Israel's kings fail to live up to the role of the Davidic king. They fail to keep the covenant. They fail to be obedient. They fail to live righteously before the Lord and to lead the people of God into righteousness. But instead, they live unrighteously, and they lead the people into wickedness. They lead the people into idol worship. And again, this is the narrative of the Old Testament, that they, instead of bringing blessing, they bring curses upon the people, that ultimately the kingdom is split, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Israel was taken into captivity in 722 by Assyria, Judah in the south in 586 by the Babylonians, carried off into captivity, and then ultimately brought back. And throughout the Old Testament and the prophets, and again, I would encourage you, go read, I think it's page 79 and following in Schreiner's book if you have it. He has a great explanation of sort of bringing out some examples from Isaiah and from Jeremiah that we're not going to go into now, of the examples of the way that the prophets, when they are calling the people back to obedience, reference time and time and time again this Davidic promise, that even as the people are being disciplined, even as they're being spit out of the promised land and taken into exile, that God is reiterating again and again and again that he has not forgotten his promise. He's not going to leave them without a redeemer. He's not going to allow them to be ultimately crushed. He's not going to remove his love from them, his care of them, his election from them ultimately. But God is going to continue to use them and preserve a remnant so that ultimately God is going to still bring that Redeemer, still bring that King, even as they're searching for it. That theme is all throughout the prophets. Isaiah and Jeremiah largely, but all the prophets as well. And I would encourage you, Schreiner has a great explanation of that goes more in depth than we're going to be able to right now. Lastly, how do we find the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant? Well, we find the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant in the New Testament, right? I want you to go with me to Matthew chapter 1. It's the first book of the New Testament. It tells us, it's a gospel. It tells us the story of Jesus. I want you to notice how Matthew begins his gospel. Matthew's writing primarily to a Jewish audience, and this is how Matthew begins his gospel. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And he goes into the genealogy of Jesus. But listen, he calls Jesus the son of David, the son of Abraham. What is Matthew doing? Matthew, at the very beginning of his gospel, is connecting Jesus to the covenant of David under the covenant of Abraham. He says those promises from the Old Testament, right? The promise that God made to Abraham, the promise that God made to David, right? This son that we've been waiting for, this royal Messiah that we've been longing for centuries, this son is now here. That I'm going to tell you about the genealogy of Jesus, the son of Abraham, the son of David. And then Matthew goes throughout the genealogy, and he's again and again and again pointing to Jesus as the son of David. Throughout the first, the whole book of Matthew, but especially the first 4 or 5 chapters of Matthew, we see Jesus as this new Israel, as this new Adam, as this new Moses, as this new Abraham, as this new David. That Jesus is presented throughout the Gospels, not just Matthew, but throughout all of the Gospels, as the long promised Messiah of the Old Testament. He is the one who comes and reigns as the king. He is the one that comes and is able to faithfully keep the covenant, to faithfully lead the people into righteousness, and to receive and to bring the promise of blessing to the people of God. That Jesus is the long-promised Messiah. We don't have time to go into all the ways the New Testament shows that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is this king, but Jesus himself claims this again and again and again. You'll remember that when Jesus is before Pontius Pilate, that Pilate says, is it true that you're a king? That Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. Jesus doesn't claim to not be a king. He doesn't say, no, I'm not a king. They've misunderstood. Jesus says, I am a king, but my kingdom is not of this world. That Jesus is bringing a kingdom. That his even at the very beginning of his ministry, when Jesus begins his ministry, how does he begin his ministry? He begins by saying, repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. Right? This is the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. If you look at Matthew chapter 4, verse 17, it says, from that time, Jesus began to preach, saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That the ministry, the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus is not just instituting a new age in the life of the world, though that's true, that the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus is inaugurating a new kingdom. Jesus is this long-promised Messiah that is bringing a king. We'll look at this a little more as we get to the new covenant next week, in week 6, the ways in which Jesus is a specific fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. But again, what we've seen is that all of these covenants from the Old Testament are pushing us forward to shining a light on the person and work of the Lord Jesus, so that Jesus is the fulfillment of the covenant. The Gospels clearly portray this. The book of Acts clearly portrays this. The rest of the epistles portray this. Revelation presents Jesus as the king king who is coming back for his bride, that Jesus is the king who's receiving a new heaven and new earth, that Jesus is ruling over the cosmos. That image is all throughout. It is unmistakably clear throughout the New Testament that this long-promised king, the descendant of David who would sit on the throne forever, is no simple man, but it is Jesus Christ who is a descendant of David, and the throne will never depart from him, that the scepter will never depart from between his feet, that Jesus will rule and reign on the throne both now and forever. He is ruling and reigning now, and he will reign for all of time, that all of the promises of the Old Testament are summed up in Jesus. We've seen that with the covenant to Adam and Eve. We've seen that with the covenant to Noah. We've seen that with the covenant to Abraham. We've seen that the covenant with Israel. And now we see that with the covenant to David. Now we're going to wrap up there. I'm going to leave some things for us for next week as we look at week 6 and sort of sum all of these things up as we look to the new covenant. And to some degree, we've talked about the new covenant in the first 5 weeks. And all of these covenants and discussion of all the other covenants, we've landed on the covenant, on the new covenant, as we've talked about the new covenant and the way that these are summed up. So what we're going to do in week 6 is try to sort of tie a nice, neat bow around this and bring all the threads back together and summarize the new covenant, give you some major features, and talk about the way, again, in some ways, recap and review the way the new covenant sums up and fulfills all the previous covenants. Thank you for joining me for week 5. Hope to see you again next week for week 6 as we look at the new covenant and the way that God is redeeming all the world to himself. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you then.